Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're plunging into some pretty seismic news from June 21st, 2025. I'm talking about the United States directly joining Israel and striking Iranian nuclear sites.
Right.
This isn't just another headline. It's a development that has sent, shockwaves across the globe, and it's certainly a lot for us all to grapple with.
Absolutely. What's truly striking here is just the sheer speed, the speed with which this whole situation escalated to direct military action and the profound implications it carries for an already incredibly volatile region.
Yeah.
This isn't really a standalone event, is it? It's more the culmination of decades of tangled history and, a complex web of geopolitical interests that have been simmering for a very, very long time.
Right. And our mission in this deep dive is really for you, our listener, to move beyond just the breaking news alerts and grasp the deeper layers here. We'll explore the immediate events that triggered these strikes. We'll unpack the long and contentious history of Iran's nuclear program. We'll also examine the vastly different perspectives out there on things like nuclear deterrence and military intervention. We have to consider the potential costs, too, human and geopolitical. And crucially, we want to reveal some of the political undercurrents that might have shaped this decision.
Exactly.
Our goal is really to help you understand what's most important in the sources you've shared so you can walk away feeling hopefully well-informed and with a clearer picture of this critical global issue.
So, how did we arrive at this critical point? Let's zoom in on the immediate trigger. The flashpoint, really, that instantly escalated decades of tension into direct military action. So June 21, 2025, President Trump announces the U.S. military struck 3 nuclear sites in Iran, directly joining Israel's ongoing efforts. And the speed of this decision is, remarkable, isn't it? It really is.
It came just 2 days after the White House had indicated a decision would be made within 2 weeks.
That swiftness isn't just a minor detail. It suggests a really urgent, almost a breakpoint moment, It signifies the U.S. moving from sort of indirect pressure to direct military engagement alongside Israel.
Right.
Which fundamentally alters the whole calculus of the conflict. And it's important to add context here. Israel reportedly played a role in softening Iran's air defenses.
Okay.
And they had already, according to reports, significantly degraded multiple Iranian nuclear sites even before the U.S. involvement.
So that indicates a highly coordinated operation then, not just an impulsive solo move.
Seems that way. Highly coordinated.
But to really grasp the gravity of this moment, we need to understand these strikes weren't just like an isolated incident. They were the culmination of a rapidly escalating series of direct confrontations just over the past year or so. Can you maybe walk us through that recent history?
Absolutely. We've seen a pretty dangerous cycle of tit-for-tat actions, really. Back on April 1st, 2024, there was a suspected Israeli airstrike in Damascus, Syria. It tragically killed Iranian generals and military advisors. That was a big deal.
Yeah, I remember that.
And Iran responded decisively. They launched over 300 drone and missile attacks directly targeting Israel. That was the first time in their history they'd done that directly. A huge shift.
Right, and it intensified even further in the fall, didn't it?
It did. In October 2024, Iran launched 180 ballistic missiles against Israel. That was apparently after Israel killed key Hamas and Hezbollah leaders.
Okay.
Israel, in turn, responded with what was described as its largest direct attack on Iran, specifically targeting things like air defenses and missile production facilities.
Wow.
So these back-and-forth exchanges really paint a picture of a region just teetering on the brink.
And those repeated missile exchanges, they highlight some really divergent views on Iran's actual military capabilities, don't they? We're seeing sources, on one hand, characterize Iran as maybe a paper tiger, saying it could hardly damage Israel with hundreds of ballistic missiles.
Right.
Yet other sources express, deep concern, saying Iran has plenty of missiles to fire and could severely impact the global economy by targeting, say, Arab Gulf companies or even blockading the Straits of Hormuz.
Yeah, and that stark difference in how Iran's military power is viewed from paper tiger to regional spoiler, it reveals a really fundamental disagreement. And that disagreement often dictates the very approach countries take, whether it's diplomacy or, confrontation.
Definitely. And in the immediate aftermath of these latest strikes, another telling detail emerged. Iran apparently experienced an internet blackout.
That's right. Which leaves a significant portion of its public, in the dark about the true picture of the conflict. And that can have profound implications for domestic stability and public response inside Iran.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so this brings us to that persistent question that has really haunted the region for decades. Iran's nuclear ambitions. This isn't exactly a new story, is it?
Oh, far from it. Iran's pursuit of a nuclear program, well, it dates back to at least 1957 under the Shah.
Wow, that far back.
Yeah. The decision to actively develop nuclear weapons, that seems to have solidified in the late 1980s during its really brutal war with Iraq. And the scale of their long-standing efforts became much clearer when hidden Iranian nuclear sites were exposed back in 2002.
Right.
So this is a deeply ingrained national objective for them, it seems.
And that historical backdrop, that eventually led to that landmark diplomatic effort in 2015, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA. Can you maybe explain the practical significance of its terms? What did it actually do?
Sure. The JCPOA was, well, it was a monumental agreement, designed specifically to significantly constrain Iran's nuclear program. Under its terms, Iran made some pretty substantial concessions. They agreed to reduce their enriched uranium stockpile by 98% for 15 years.
98%, okay.
Yeah. And the cut operating centrifuges, those are the machines used to enrich uranium by 2/3 for 10 years. All of this was basically designed to push back Iran's breakout time.
Would you?
That's the theoretical period it would take for them to produce enough fissile material for one weapon. The goal was to push that to over a year.
Got it. Yeah.
And in exchange, Iran received crucial sanctions relief totaling nearly $100 billion. A huge economic incentive.
Right. However, that agreement saw a pretty dramatic reversal, didn't it?
It did. A really significant shift occurred in 2018 when the Trump administration unilaterally withdrew the U.S. from the JCPOA. They reimposed sanctions, even though European allies refused to follow suit. They wanted to keep the deal alive.
Yeah.
But the U.S. withdrawal plunged Iran into its worst economic crisis in about 40 years. It halved its oil exports, and perhaps ironically, it actually emboldened the hardliners within Iran who had always been skeptical of the deal in the first place.
Okay, so this brings us right to the core of the debate today over Iran's nuclear intent. What's the real story right now regarding Iran's current nuclear status? Because there seems to be deeply conflicting information out there.
Yeah, that contradiction isn't just significant. It really highlights a critical chasm in how different sources assess Iran's immediate threat. And that assessment directly impacts the rationale behind, military action versus diplomatic pressure.
Makes sense.
So on one hand, some sources contend that Iran is, quote, enriching uranium to levels that only have a military purpose.
Okay.
And that it's building nuclear weapons, or at least working towards it. That's one side.
Yeah.
However, this is directly countered by the viewpoint that, well, enriching, not refining, uranium is not weaponization in itself, and that Iran openly talks about it, implying some level of transparency, or at least not total secrecy.
Interesting distinction.
And here's the crucial piece, I think. The U.S. intelligence community concluded just a few months ago that Iran was not actively building a nuclear weapon.
Okay, that intel assessment feels like a really crucial detail in this whole picture.
It does.
And then there's this whole concept of nuclear deterrence. How do the sources view Iran's potential acquisition of nuclear weapons through that lens?
Well, it's a fundamental divergence, really. Some sources argue that possessing nuclear weapons is the ultimate deterrent for a nation's security. They specifically cite North Korea as an example where, arguably, nuclear arms have kept powers like the U.S. and maybe even Israel from attacking directly. It's seen as an equalizer.
Yeah, the ultimate insurance policy, some might say.
Exactly. Conversely, others argue quite vehemently that Iran is not the country you want to have nukes, especially if concerns exist about what they refer to as religious genocidal maniacs. That language is used in some sources.
Okay.
So this highlights the really profound geopolitical and ideological anxieties surrounding Iran potentially getting the bomb.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we talk about direct military action, particularly in a region as volatile as the Middle East, we absolutely have to consider the potential for catastrophe. One of our sources is very starkly titled, "A U.S. war with Iran would be a catastrophe." What does that sentiment imply?
Well, it implies a potential worst-case scenario that extends far beyond just these immediate strikes. There are genuine concerns, serious concerns, that a full-scale war could, quote, bring down the entire Middle East,
Wow.
creating an unprecedented regional conflagration. And beyond the obvious human cost, just consider the immense logistical challenges for any potential ground invasion. Iran is geographically vast, 2.5 times larger than Afghanistan, with notoriously difficult terrain.
Right.
This leads many analysts to believe that taking Tehran would be hard, taking the rest of the country would never end. It's just too big, too complex.
And history sort of backs that up.
It does. Historically, even powerful nations like Britain and the Soviet Union limited their, quote, occupations of Iran mainly to areas near the Caspian Sea. They didn't try to control the whole country.
Interesting. This situation also brings to mind what some people are describing as a kind of social PTSD from previous U.S. engagements, right? Thinking about Iraq and Afghanistan, where interventions arguably made things worse by creating chaos in the region without a clear plan.
Yeah.
What are the specific fears this time around, given those past experiences?
It's a very real concern, absolutely echoes those fears. There's a tangible fear that a regime change in Iran, even if successful in the short term, could create an even more dangerous power vacuum,
Right.
potentially leading to the rise of an ISIS-like group, maybe even worse,
Oh, boy.
and triggering another refugee crisis that would put immense pressure on Europe and further destabilize the whole region. And this feeds directly into the debate over whether targeted airstrikes, like the ones on nuclear facilities, actually achieve long-term strategic goals, or do they simply lead to the eventual rebuilding of infrastructure and just a rinse, wash, and repeat cycle of conflict?
That's a sobering thought.
It is. For all the immediate impact, we might just be resetting the clock on future confrontations down the line.
It's truly eye-opening, then, to consider how public sentiment seemed to align or maybe didn't align with this dramatic foreign policy decision. What did the polls actually reveal about what Americans wanted just days before these strikes happened?
Well, there was a poll conducted just before the June 21st strikes, from June 13th to 16th, 2025, and it found that a significant majority, 60% of Americans, actually oppose direct U.S. military action in a potential war with Iran.
60% opposed.
Yeah, with only a small fraction, about 16%, favoring it. Most people prefer diplomacy and negotiation regarding Iran's nuclear program.
That raises a pretty important question, doesn't it? About the alignment, or lack thereof, between public sentiment and these major foreign policy decisions.
It really does. And while, 50% of Americans view Iran as an enemy and another 25% see it as unfriendly, it's also worth noting that in the same polling timeframe, only 36% viewed Israel specifically as an ally.
Only 36%.
Right. Nearly half saw Israel as either friendly or were actually uncertain, so it's not a straightforward picture.
That is a fascinating disparity. And we also see sentiments expressed in some of the sources, that the U.S. is acting as Israel's proxy or even paid help in the region. How do those views kind of factor into this broader discussion of public opinion and foreign policy alignment?
Well, those sentiments, they speak to a deep skepticism, I think, in some corners about the motivations behind U.S. foreign policy, particularly regarding its engagements in the Middle East. It suggests a perception, right or wrong, that U.S. interests might sometimes be secondary to those of its allies, or maybe that domestic political considerations are driving decisions that are actually quite unpopular with the general public.
Right. Okay, so next, we really have to consider the political chessboard here, the motivations behind these incredibly high-stakes decisions. What were the driving forces behind President Trump's decision to strike, according to the sources we looked at?
Well, sources suggest the decision was heavily influenced by the prodding of Israeli officials and many Republican lawmakers.
Yep.
This aligns with a significant segment of the Republican voter base, over 60% in one poll cited, who apparently support bombing Iran. It fits into a kind of peace through superior firepower philosophy that's quite prevalent there. But there are also some voices suggesting a more personal motivation, citing a possible personal vendetta against Iran because of reports that Iran had wanted to assassinate Trump.
Ah, right. I remember those reports.
So it seems like a complex blend: geopolitical pressure, domestic political alignment, and potentially some personal retribution mixed in.
And it also highlights what some see as a perceived inconsistency, doesn't it?
Yes, for some critics, it definitely does. They point to what they see as hypocrisy in Trump's stance on military intervention, say in Ukraine versus Iran.
Oh, so.
Suggesting a selective application of non-interventionist principles, perhaps. This leads to accusations that such military actions might be strategically timed, maybe as a distraction from domestic issues, or perhaps to gain political leverage during a politically sensitive time.
The wag the dog scenario, some might call it. Okay, so beyond the political motivations and the public sentiment, there's a really profound legal question at the heart of this. Presidential authority for military action without prior congressional approval. This isn't exactly a new issue in U.S. history, is it?
No, not at all. It's a recurrent debate, comes up again and again. Presidents have historically conducted military operations without formal declarations of war quite often. The legal framework here is largely governed by the War Powers Resolution.
Right. Remind us how that works.
Well, it requires the president to notify Congress within 48 hours of introducing U.S. armed forces into hostilities or situations where hostilities seem imminent. Congress then has 60 days with a possible 30-day extension to either authorize the action or direct the removal of those forces.
Okay, so how does that legal framework apply specifically to these strikes on Iran? Could past authorizations maybe be used?
That's precisely where the legal challenges really arise. Legally justifying attacks on Iran using past authorizations. It's tricky. For example, using the 2001 authorization for use of military force, the AUMF, which was passed after 9/11 to target groups like al-Qaeda.
Right, the post-9/11 authorization.
Exactly. Applying that to Iran is particularly difficult because, well, Iran is a Shia theocracy, and that's critical because the 2001 AUMF was primarily aimed at Sunni fundamentalist groups like al-Qaeda and the Taliban.
Different groups entirely.
Right. So trying to legally stretch that authorization to cover a Shia state like Iran presents a significant hurdle for legal scholars and policymakers. It's a tough argument to make stick.
And yet, there's a somewhat cynical view expressed in some sources that Congress might be unlikely to actually challenge a president on actions like this, regardless of the legal nuances. What does that imply for the checks and balances of power, if that's true?
Well, it implies that often political realities can trump legal arguments when it comes to military intervention. This cynical view suggests that, especially in moments of perceived crisis, Congress might be reluctant to appear, unpatriotic or to undermine a president's actions in the field. Effectively, it could mean ceding significant war powers to the executive branch, maybe by default. And that raises really deep questions about the separation of powers and the accountability for these dramatic foreign policy decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, if we connect this to the bigger picture again, the U.S. possesses a pretty unique strategic advantage with its strategic bombers,
Right.
Capable of these deep strikes. What does that capability mean for the dynamics of intervention?
It means the U.S. has a capacity for power projection and precision strikes that very few other nations, even major powers, can actually match. This definitely changes the calculus for potential adversaries. The U.S. can theoretically reach targets deep within their territory with, well, devastating effect. It provides a unique kind of leverage in military engagements, no doubt.
However, leveraging that capability also brings very real, immediate concerns for U.S. military personnel stationed across the Middle East, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Critical point. Sources mention that the U.S. has had multiple casualties from Iran-linked militants just within the last year.
Right.
This suggests to some that Iran is already in an undeclared state of war against the U.S. through funding and arming proxies. So the U.S. presence is already vulnerable, and launching direct strikes significantly heightens that risk for troops on the ground.
Yeah, a very dangerous situation for them. And that leads to another big question for the geopolitical chessboard. What might Russia's reaction be to a, let's say, U.S.-controlled or significantly destabilized Iran, especially given their current military commitments in Ukraine? How might that ripple through global power dynamics?
That's a huge question. Russia and Iran have a very complex relationship. Often, they align against perceived Western influence. But it's not a simple alliance. A U.S.-controlled or significantly destabilized Iran could open up a whole new front of geopolitical competition. It could potentially draw Russia further into Middle Eastern affairs, maybe diverting resources or attention, or it could cause them to recalibrate their efforts in Ukraine somehow.
So more uncertainty.
Yeah, exactly. It adds another immense layer of complexity and raises the specter of even broader global repercussions. It's not just a regional issue anymore.
Okay. So after digging through all of this, what does it all mean for you as someone just trying to stay informed in a world that feels, frankly, more complex by the minute?
Well, we've peeled back quite a few layers in this deep dive, haven't we? We looked at the swift, direct U.S. involvement in strikes against Iran, the deep historical roots of Iran's nuclear program and its relationship with global powers,
Right.
the really contrasting views on nuclear deterrence, the potential for vast human and geopolitical consequences if this conflict widens, and, of course, the intricate political considerations that seem to be driving decisions behind the scenes.
A lot to take in.
It is, and knowledge is, most valuable when it's understood and applied. Considering multiple perspectives is absolutely essential in this world of information overload we live in. And thinking about all this, it really raises an important question, I think. In an era where these global conflicts are so deeply influenced by decades of history, economic interests, domestic political calculations, can targeted military strikes like these truly achieve lasting peace and stability? Or do they actually risk entangling us further in perpetual cycles of conflict that ultimately reshape the global order in ways we might not even foresee?
That is a lot to think about. As always, a crucial question to ponder. We encourage you to continue critically exploring these nuanced issues as they continue to unfold.